Okay, so thank you all for being here. This has already been an incredible conference, and so I'm very excited, honored that Michael and Erez asked me to participate and introduce these two wonderful speakers. And you already had a little preview at the end of the last session of some of what we're going to hear now in the second panel. We will, since we are starting a few minutes late, we're going to go a few minutes beyond what we said. So instead of going from 2:30 to 3:45, we are going to go from now, which is 2:50, till 4 o'clock. So just for planning purposes. And so I will do exactly what Michael did and introduce the first speaker and then hear his talk, and then introduce the second speaker, and then we will take your questions. So our first our first speaker is going to be Tzvi Ben-Dor Ben-Nite, who is he's a professor at NYU, at New York University, in several departments. I guess your home is the Department of History and the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and also is a member of the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. And he is, and
by courtesy.
And by courtesy. Well, they're lucky. And he's the author of a fascinating range of books. The Tao of Muhammad, A Cultural History of Muslims in Late Imperial China. And also a book on the 10 Lost Tribes, A World History. And he has co-edited an anthology that was published 10 years ago on modern Middle Eastern Jewish thought, writings on identity, politics, and culture, and also The Scaffolding of Sovereignty, Global and Aesthetic Perspectives on the History of a Concept. So we will hear first from Tzvi, who will be talking about Mizrahim in Israel, the thirst for history.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It is rare for me to be in a conference and a panel that I would say most of the participants are dear to me intellectually, personally, and politically. I am going to talk a little bit about, what I call the thirst for history. And it begins with a very, very simple question. We now have enough depth and enough time, for Israel that exists, 75 years, to ask yourself what is Israeli history. And clearly, the creation or the rise of a collective that identifies itself as Mizrahim, yes, in other words, as something other than just Israelis, brings with it and tells all sorts of questions. Why no one expected that, of course. No one from the founding fathers of Zionism designed that. The idea was that the modern Jewish state is going to be a place where in gathering of all exiles, and probably, all of these exiles will be ingathered and will create, a one single entity. Okay. Well, we now have two collectives, at least two collectives. In Israel, recently, the outgoing president spoke about the 4 tribes, so maybe 4 collectives, etc. But all would agree that the basic divide among the Jewish population would be between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Okay, not every Ashkenazic person in Israel self-identifies as an Ashkenazic. Some insist basically that there's no division and they are just Israelis. But most Mizrahim self-identify as Mizrahim. In other words, as something other than the just Israelis. Now that begs the question: what is their history if it is to be something that is distinctive, at least partly distinctive, than general Israeli history? Okay, where is their place in it? Okay, now if we add to this that if the division among the Jewish population is the basic fact, we should add to it also that it's not just a division, it's not just 2 separate groups. We're talking about a collective that, and you had a taste of that part of it is also a history of oppression, a history of discrimination, that it contributes to the rise of this distinctive identity. Now, part of that as well, is also a history of erasure. Okay, in other words, how do you write Mizrahi history when the general ideology speaks about an ingathering of all nations, ingathering of all exiles, and we're all Israelis? Okay. Now, Mizrahim have been writing Mizrahi histories of Israel. In other words, they have been writing different interpretations of what they think is both the history of Israel seen from a point of view of a Mizrahi person, but also the history of Mizrahim in Israel. Now, you never heard of these histories. The reason why you never heard of these histories is because, like they were not part of the mainstream. Nothing was published in any mainstream journals or publications. Nothing gained any recognition. It was something that, was contradictory to, the general or the official ideology of Israel. 3 examples that are kind of recent, Ben Zion Yosefov, Demokratia, or Democracy, and the Cry of the Mizrahim. I'm sorry for the my poor picture that I took. Yes, this is a man who wrote. Actually, he was a member of the Zionist religious party. Okay, and I deliberately bring him here because this is not something that has to do with the left-right divide. Okay, another person. A very, very respectable Iraqi accountant from Ramat Gan, where there are a lot of Iraqis, and all of them are accountants, yes, wrote a book called HaMasecha, The Mask. Over 900-page book, yes, an introduction, yes, a 900-page book, an introduction to the ethnic strategy of, and he uses a very, very strong word here, I would translate it as the government or authority, but mishtar is a regime, like it's a very, very strong word. So and of course, it's a comparative study, an unbelievable book that only an Iraqi accountant can write. He basically documents everything, every single case of discrimination against Mizrahim in Israel. The third one is Bavel and Katrilevke. Yes, the birth of Mizrahi political Zionism. Now, Bavel, Babylon, yes, code also for Baghdad, code also for Iraq. This guy is not an Iraqi accountant, but he is very close. But Katrilevke, of course, is a code for the shtetl that has been immortalized, yes, and I'm very hesitating to say Sholem Aleichem, but I think it is Sholem. No, it is Sholem, thank God. I'm not gonna, yeah. So again, Kasrilivke, yes. Okay, so these are just examples, and I tell you that I'm Iraqi, but a non-Iraqi accountant. So if I were an Iraqi accountant, I would give you hundreds of such examples of histories and so on. But wait a minute. Today, not only that these histories are not erased, they are the mainstream. Last year, a book, Second Israel, by this author who has a PhD in religious studies and a very, very important journalist, yes, of Moroccan extraction, a Jerusalem-born like myself, called Second Israel, let me translate it into English. Let's call it, HaBesora HaMetuka, the sweet gospel, or the sweet message, and the bitter oppression, okay? That has been recognized by the Prime Minister. It's a bestseller. It sells a ton of books. Its author appears everywhere. And right now, if you go online to his Facebook page, you will have a daily reading of him reading the book. Okay.
And it's not on his Facebook, it's also on the radio.
Of course, on the radio, you can have it and so on and so forth. Yeah. What? Avishai Ben Chaim. Okay. So the question that I ask, how did we get there? The books that I showed you before, by the way, were all published in the 90s and in the 2000s. How did we get there so quickly that actually an alternative history of Israel, which is a Mizrahi history, is by definition an alternative history of Israel, that speaks very clearly about the most basic fact, yes, which is like there are two Israels, suddenly becomes a bestseller. Okay, a quick journey on the histories of Mizrahim, and we will begin with Avraham Abbas. Avraham Abbas was born in Syria. He came to the Yishuv during the 30s. He was a member of Achdut Avoda, which means that he was in the a member of labor Zionism. And Achdut Avoda, they were super Zionists and super socialists. Yes, both hardcore in both ways. In 1948, we find him in the Knesset, okay, as a member of the ruling party. And also, he is now he's also in the Histadrut, which is the most important labor union at the time, enormous amount of power, and he's in charge of the Mizrahi workers. In other words, workers who come from the Arab and Islamic lands, Middle Eastern lands to Israel. That means that he has the most accurate social data about labor, about housing, about education, about every social aspect of Mizrahi life in Israel. And remember, this is a young Israel. This is the first decade. Okay. In 1958, he writes a small booklet in Hebrew, but I'm going to use here the translation of it into English. And he calls himself, he talks about, which is called From Ingathering to Integration. It is a bitter book. It is a very, very bitter book, okay? And I'm not going to read all of it, but this is the introduction of the Sephardim Council in Jerusalem, you know, to the English translation of this book. They speak about Avraham Abbas, who was part of the ruling party, as a man who had a change of heart, okay, a change of mind, yes? In fact, he spent most of the time of this decade opposed to the idea that there are two Israels created, opposed to the idea that, in fact, the policies of the government of Israel are creating a new collective. In other words, they are not treating everybody equally. Okay? He was opposed to this idea. But then he wrote, he didn't know he passed away right after he wrote that. He didn't know that. He was a very young man. He wrote a very, very bitter thing. This is his funeral, you see, with major leaders of the Labor Party of Israel at the time, which is major leaders of the government. Okay, a very important national figure. Okay, and he writes in very, very harsh terms. He says, you know, if you don't listen to me now, and this is just after 10 years that Israel was created. If you don't listen to me now, you know, and we will not reach a just and equitable solution, you know, the survival of the state is at stake. In other words, he says, this Israel will not survive, okay? And that is less than 10 years after Israel was created, and less than 10 years after the majority of the people whom we call today Mizrahim come to Israel, about 800,000 at that point particularly, not even, okay? Already then, you know, this man who probably had the most accurate data on labor, housing, and education at the time, and on the division on these issues, writes that, okay? And here's how he concludes. Most of the Oriental Jews, and he uses the term Mizrahim, have been cruelly and bitterly disappointed. They have ceased to have any faith in the public declarations of the party leaders about true equality for all the citizens of Israel. Okay? Now, this is a radical statement, and it makes me excited precisely because it comes from the heart of the government. Okay? And it is also very, very clear, you know, that Abbas's Syrian origin is at play here. Okay? This is a Zionist socialist committed to socialism, committed to Zionism. Yes, the Achdut Avoda was very much to the right, yes, in terms of, you know, the policies concerning Zionism, and very much on the left, you know, concerning socialism. And here's what he says. Now, I have to do it very, very quickly, so I'm going to jump. Okay? It is unbelievable to think that, you know, he published that in 1958 for the 10th anniversary of the State of Israel, a year before what we call the Wadi Salib rebellion or the Wadi Salib riots, which is violent clashes between Mizrahim and the government, yes, And I'm sitting here, next to the expert, so I'm going to hesitate. He might talk about it later, so I'm going to skip that. Violent, clashes between Mizrahi citizens of Israel, and the government and the police erupt in Haifa and spread elsewhere. Okay? In other words, there is now clear violent sign of social unrest. Okay. Now, very, very briefly, I want to move to the 60s. Okay? And we need to ask ourselves who translated that from Hebrew to English, and why, the Sephardic Council of Jerusalem felt that they needed to translate that into English. Well, they were desperate to get the word out. They were desperate to speak to the rest of the Jewish world and say something really, really bad is happening in Israel. Ethnic division of labor, yes, is being created in Israel, and you need to know about it. Because, in fact, the Zionist dream is being betrayed. Middle Eastern Jews, Arab Jews are being brought to Israel, yeah, and they are being discriminated against. Okay? Someone might say that, in 1948, a lot of Arabs left the land because they were not Jews, and a lot of Arabs were brought to the land because they were Jews. Okay? So the person who actually translated that is someone by the name of Michael Seltzer. And here he giving a talk, publicizing the book, which is called, Social Ethnic Conflict in Israel by Michael Seltzer. Okay? And here he is, a young man, this is an interview that he gave for one of the newspapers at the time, because he had a hunger strike outside the government offices in Jerusalem, where he said, I'm following the ways of resistance of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, who is Michael Seltzer, and why am I talking about someone whose name is Seltzer in a conference on Mizrahim? Okay. Okay. First of all, that's the book that he writes. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Michael Seltzer was born in Germany, and the family escaped during the Holocaust to India, to colonial India, where he spent the first few years of his life in a concentration camp for citizens of enemy nations, because they were considered Germans. They were in a concentration camp. This is in northern colonial India in today's Pakistan. He experiences the division between India and Pakistan in 1947. Later on, the family moves to England, where he goes to Oxford, and he joins the Zionist movement there, and he becomes the president of the Zionist Student Union in Oxford. In 1963, he comes to Israel, and he has all of this baggage of having lived in India. Okay, and he lives in Jerusalem. And very quickly he realized, and he says this in the interview, he says, well, the Mizrahim are like the Indians. Okay? The Mizrahim are like the Indians. And he joins the Sephardic Council, and he begins to interview people, and he serves as their liaison to the press in France and in England. Okay? And he gathers a lot of information. And there's a beautiful vignette in the book. He says, yeah, I'm living here. I'm going to the synagogue in Bet HaKerem, to the German Jewish synagogue, and I hear how they speak, very disparagingly and very pejoratively about Mizrahim, and they don't know that the person who's sitting next to them is a young Indian boy. Okay? Okay. Michael Seltzer left Israel. But in 1968, he published a book in New York that he was been writing already in Israel, called The Aryanization of the Jewish State, in which he asked two questions and gave two answers. Okay, first of all, it's a shocking title. Okay, when I discovered the book in the library, I was blown away. I couldn't believe that someone could write it. I opened 411. There were 35 Michael Seltzers in the United States. I called each one of them. I said, are you the Michael Seltzer that wrote the book, Aryanization of the Jewish State? Okay. I didn't find him, but then I discovered 14 years later the family archives of his father, the whole story about the Holocaust and the escape in Evo in 16th Street in New York. Then I discovered who donated the archive. It was his nephew, and then I have been interviewing Michael Seltzer since then. Yeah, I even know why he was denied tenure at Brooklyn College by 1977. The whole story. Okay. Yeah. An unbelievable, a very, very prolific and amazing thinker. So he asked two questions. Why do Ashkenazim hate Mizrahim? Yes. And what's going to happen? The first answer, he says, well, Zionism begins, when European Jews actually are labeled as Orientals in Europe. They are understood in Germany to be people who belong into the Orient. So they dream, and they are rejected by the Europeans. So what they do is they dream about creating a Western European country in the East, in Palestine. Okay? He's right. This is what Herzl was talking about. This is what a lot of people are talking about. The definition of a Jew is a European Jew, and if we can't be accepted in Europe, let's build a Europe somewhere else, okay, in the Middle East. But then he says, well, then they come to Israel, and then they see all of these Arab Jews, and they remind them that they are actually Semites and Middle Easterners. Even though they escaped Europe, they created a Europe in the Middle East, they're basically like they said. That's why they hate them, okay? Now, it sounds ridiculous, but this is an argument that Hannah Arendt obliquely makes in her report on Eichmann when she describes the Arab Jewish policemen outside the trial. She describes them as Arabs. Yes, very, very uncomfortable about that. And if you think about, later Mizrahi critical post-colonial writings, such as Ella Shohat and Aziza Kazum, they would make the same argument. In other words, there are a series of orientalizations, in other words, taking people and making them Oriental that begins actually in Europe. Okay? And when the Orientalized Jews from Europe who created their own little Europe in the Middle East, they find themselves, stuck with, 3 million, Arab Jews from Yemen, Iraq, and so on and so forth. That's why they hate them, okay? Because they remind them of who they really are. And then he says something else. He says, well, I predict that in the end of the day, there will be an uprising, an alliance between the Palestinians and the Mizrahim against the Israeli regime, okay? He also makes lots of predictions about the diaspora. He says you need to understand that the Zionist dream is over. You need to think about your own identity in the diaspora, etc., etc., etc. I'm going to make it very, very quick. Now, was he right?
In a way, he was.
Of course he was right, but no. I mean, he wrote this in 65, 66. What he couldn't predict is the 67 war. Yes? But there was an uprising. And this is the Black Panthers movement in 1971. There was an uprising. In other words, there was basically after a decade after the Wadi Salib riot, now there was an uprising of the Black Panthers movement, and a huge eruption, okay? Of course, inspired by the American Black Panthers. It continues all the way to the 1980s, thank God, because then I was able to pretend I'm joining it myself as a 14-year-old, okay? The neighborhood where I grew up was one of the two centers, okay? This is where I am. In addition to that, there's another group called the Tents Group that, begins in 1973 that, picks, this is mostly about housing. It's not about culture. It's not about, identity, which is all what Mizrahim seem to be doing today. It's about, equality. It's about culture. It's about labor, it's about housing, it's about education. And by the way, most of these movements gravitate toward the left. They even seek alliances with Palestinians, okay? Yamin Suissa, from my neighborhood, 1980, creates the Tents movement. You can see the Che Guevara there. He said, and this was very daring to say this in 1990, he says, even I will speak with Yasser Arafat if he will give me a home. Okay? Yeah. The Tents movement there, I'm making very, very quickly. In 1990, and this is something that I had a chance also to actually be part of a student movement then and also leading, there was another eruption. All over the country, major protests, much bigger than the 2011 housing protest of the middle class, that is now was them being screwed, of people from the neighborhoods all over. Most of it was Mizrahi. The context of the trigger for it was the Russian immigration after the fall of the Soviet Union, but also a decade of neglect by the none other than of David Levy, who is a Mizrahi himself. As 10 years he continuously was Minister of Housing, but didn't do anything at that period. Okay. And this is the 1990 protest. This is a protest that is completely forgotten. When you talk about the social protest in Israel, everybody's going to mention the 2011 protest. No one's going to mention that, okay? And here is more. I'm going to skip that, and so on. Now, in 1981, we begin to move away from social protests, okay? Some Mizrahi politicians in Israel begin to talk about tradition, about Masoret. Yes, as if we needed them to be reminded of, of our tradition or our Masoret, as if but it becomes now suddenly there is a certain bifurcation, and there is a beginning of a discourse actually about identity that begin to emphasize more and more and more that the Mizrahim in Israel are a traditional entity, and the reason why they break with mainstream Zionism is because mainstream Zionism is too secular, okay? This goes against a legacy of 50 or 40 years of 30-something years of actually social struggle. Okay, most of the people who participate in that are serious activists, actually, that come from the social movements. But they see this as part of their aspiration. Okay, and here's what I'm doing it very, very quickly. Here's how we come today. From that moment on, we can see a break in Mizrahi histories. Instead of talking about inequalities, which remain persistent, yes, remain persistent, and some of us insist, that it has to be about justice and has to be about equality and social issues. Suddenly you have other issues a little bit more. There's more emphasis on the question of identity, and Mizrahi identity suddenly becomes the purpose unto itself. Yes, instead of a vehicle, a mobilizing vehicle, that's now the purpose. Yes, and also it's all about telling stories, telling histories of Mizrahim, and making them part of the mainstream. Yes, and of course, hatred of the hegemony. Yes, the Ashkenazic hegemony is now something that is being hated. Okay. And here's how we come, to the book Second Israel, which organizes Mizrahi history in Israel according to the following lines. And Avishai Ben Chaim, he already hates me enough. He will be okay if I reduce him one more time. So he makes three arguments. He says, first of all, there are two Israels. Okay, Mizrahim are the second Israel. They have been oppressed by the Ashkenazic hegemony forever. And the way they've been doing that, the way the Ashkenazic hegemony has been doing that is, first of all, driving them away from religion, but also persecuting them at courts. In other words, all Mizrahi politicians, that they rise to power, the moment they rise to power, they've been, they dig something on them, they frame them, and they send them to court. Zero social issues in the book, okay? I summarized the argument, okay? The second is Mizrahi, Jewish, poor, and persecuted and persecuted. This is first the Bibi, etc., etc., etc. Now, funny enough, and I want to talk about the present moment and close with the present moment, the tragedy is that he takes very, very strong elements, from 75 years of struggle by all sorts of people who've been erased, been forgotten, been publishing in samizdat newspapers, being labeled as dissidents, sometimes persecuted. The people in Wadi Salib and some of the people of the Black Panthers were considered mentally ill and were put in mental asylums, okay? All of that, takes that part, and moves it into a new framework of a new story, okay? But then again, why is it so successful, okay? It is successful because at least since 2015, if not a little before, in the present government have been adopting, and we see this before, Begin tried to do this as well, but this is more and more pronounced now, have been adopting, in the context of a politics of resentment, has been adopting, Mizrahi arguments, co-opting Mizrahi arguments, yes, for its own political survival, particularly the political survivor of its embattled Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who, by the way, is not Ashkenazic, but in fact the focus of Mizrahi aspiration. Yes, he is, but not according to this. Wait, I'm gonna done. Yeah. As Avishai Ben Porat portrays him, more than Netanyahu uses the Mizrahim use Netanyahu. The Mizrahim, having realized they cannot break Ashkenazi hegemony, what they did is they say, let's get ourselves an agent. Let's pick an Ashkenazic specimen, make him our own leader, and use him in order to crush the Israeli hegemony. That's the argument that he makes in the book, okay? Now, did he coin the term Israel, Second Israel? In fact, the term Second Israel has been existing since the 50s. Other people have been writing about it in social context. Okay, here you have some examples for that from the 50s as well. Okay, and here again, more than Israel is Netanyahu is using Second Israel is using Netanyahu, and he talks about a new covenant, a new alliance between the Mizrahim and between nationalism, between traditionalism, and between the Mizrahim and Netanyahu. That's the foundation of the new Israel, which will come after we crush, first Israel today. Now, why this is so powerful? This gets legitimacy from the government, and the legitimation for a Mizrahi voice, no matter how contradicting it is to the mainstream tenets of Zionist ideology, for God's sake, yes? Is immediately, allows it to be legitimate and acceptable depending to what it is used. Yes, I'm going to be finishing in 1 minute.
Also to delegitimize Mizrahim to speak otherly.
Yeah, we speak otherly. Yes, of course, and he also portrays Netanyahu as Dreyfus. In fact, he said that Dreyfus suffered less than Netanyahu. Yes. And finally, the image of Mizrahi Messiah. I mean, I wrote about, the fact he specifically speaks about him as a Messiah. He says, he's a man who drives history, not driven by history, etc., etc., etc. And this is a famous picture, of Netanyahu in southern Tel Aviv. Yes, more than 10 years after he's in continued rule, southern Tel Aviv is still in trouble. Problems still continue, and he goes there, and he's the Messiah, and people are kissing his hands, and so on and so forth. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
One thing I neglected to say in Tzvi's bio is that he's not only an academic, but he's also an activist. And I'm sure you can't imagine that, right? So thank you so much. We will hear from Brian Roby, and then we will have some questions. Brian Roby is an associate professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern history at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And he focuses in his research on the history of racism and race, on Black diasporas and Jewish identity in Israel and Palestine and North Africa from the 19th century to the present. His first book is on our subject today. His first book is called The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 to 1966, and that focused, as you'll hear, on social justice protests in Israel. And his current book project, very, very timely, is Blackness Refracted: Race and the Making of the Jewish Color Line in the 20th Century. And that traces the migration history of racialized Jewish communities and ideas across seas and oceans. So looking forward to hearing from you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, thanks, yeah. Oh, I guess I do need to take this, huh? So I want to start, one, with a little anecdote about a young Black American woman who's a PhD student at NYU in 1950. She goes to Israel to study the issue of Yemenite Jews in sociological terms and their integration within Israeli society. And as she's walking down the street in Jerusalem, she hears the word, I'm not going to say it, but it's the equivalent of the N-word in Hebrew. She hears some young children call out this, and she grabs one of them who's blonde and says, why are you calling me the N-word? And the kid says, no, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not calling you that. I'm calling him that, and points to a young Yemenite boy. And as she's kind of perplexed because she assumes that, she's Black, that's the kind of thing that she would get. Why would he call this young boy that? She finds out that he's actually an American-born kid who just migrated to the country. And throughout her memoir, she talks about this kind of issue. Something that I'm kind of struggling with too is how did this idea of Blackness for Mizrahim in general come to be at play within Israeli society? And what I argue is that it does not start with the Black Panthers, and it actually doesn't even start in 1948. In fact, it really comes from mid-19th century Zionist engagement with scientific racism. And just for some context, so really we have kind of three major racial categories of Jews within Israeli society today. We have Ashkenazim, who are broadly considered white, European origin Jews, Mizrahim, which I'll touch upon a bit, a diverse group of Afro-Asian origin Jews, most migrated in 1950 to 1970, and then the Beta Israel, Ethiopian origin Jews, most migrated late 1970s into the 1990s. And this, just want to give you a little taste here to explain why I'm using this term Afro-Asian. So these are like the major cities in which Jews lived, at least prior to 1948. These are all like every dot is like a little city. So we have as far west as Morocco, as far east as Singapore, India, Pakistan, of course, as well. And this gets at that question of Arab Jews, Mizrahim, Sephardim, in which I think in terms of the Hebrew, Mizrahim makes sense more because it points to the non-normative Israeliness of a racialized group. In English, I think Afro-Asian is much more kind of relevant, at least in terms of scholarship. One, because it points to the places where they come from, that their history is not just based around Zionism and the state of Israel. It comes well before and continues after. And then two, that almost all of these communities have a very transnational history. And so Moroccan Jews, of course, did not just migrate to Israel, or Indian Jews did not just migrate to Israel. They migrated to the US, the UK. Their histories are intertwined both with Zionism to a certain extent, as well as other colonial histories as well. All right. And so what I want to talk about today is, this is just the kind of chapter by chapter, I won't go through all of that. The main thing to know is that the first half of it goes through an intellectual history of this, why, how throughout from the 19th century until the early 20th century, German Jewish, especially German and American Jewish scholars created this idea of a racialized Black community of Jews across the non-European world. And then in the second half, I go into a more social history of how Mizrahi Jews themselves started to kind of use that term and embrace it as a symbol of empowerment. And as a reminder, when I talk about Blackness, although in the US context, we often look at skin color and other phenotypic features, I want to point to the fact that it's problematic to really do that, to kind of try to locate, well, they don't look Black, or that isn't Black to me in that sense, because it cannot be located on the body. We have to remember that Blackness looks and acts differently in so many different cultural and societal contexts and historical contexts. And to try to identify it on the body oftentimes reproduces the same kind of biological determinism that oftentimes we try to get away from, at least many of us try to get away from. Okay. So many Israeli historians might find the assertion that Afro-Asian Jews were racialized as Black counterintuitive, perhaps even provocative, because the idea of a unity of a Jewish people within the confines of the modern nation state of Israel, Palestine, has been a prevalent narrative since the late 19th century. Well, what my research shows is that European origin Zionists were oftentimes shaped by global conversations on race and blackness and explicitly separated themselves racially from non-European Jews and often saw non-whiteness as a barrier to authentic belonging to Jewishness. Doubts abounded surrounding the Jewishness of certain Afro-Asian Jews, particularly those around the Mediterranean Ocean and the Red Seas and the Indian Ocean, particularly Yemenites, Indian Jews, and Ethiopian or East African Jews, were oftentimes questioned whether or not they were truly Jewish or not during this period of time. Yitzhak Ben Zvi, the famous Orientalist that has an institute named after him, affirmed a hierarchical view of Afro-Asian Jewry as backwards, freezing them in a sort of European Middle Ages, while depicting European Jewry as advanced. And this was kind of paradoxically meant to emphasize the unity of the Jewish nation, and that he claimed that using the term of race was inappropriate, but that there were two main separate categories, racial categories of Jews, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, as he called it, in which the Ashkenazim were the Europeans and the Sephardim and Mizrahim, on the other hand, were the second category. And that they were not anybody else, basically anybody that is not European was Mizrahim. In looking at what the differences were, the two, he argued that it was not necessarily about the origin of Motza or race or Geza, but that he considered that it's really the long-term influence of the neighboring non-Jewish population. So making this implication that Jews outside of Europe oftentimes were possibly not Jewish because they interacted so much with tribes of non-Jewish communities, and would say that really, it is kind of a product of over several generations. And at this point of time, what he's trying to do in this kind of rhetorical framework is to shift away from this early scientific race notion of like finding physical anthropology to a more sociological term in which you would see, you can kind of make an argument that, well, they're more like a global Black community in that they have these problems with juvenile delinquency, alcoholism, or various other kind of forms of that. And to be clear, that Jewish racial difference does not start with Zionism. It does really start back in 1492 with the expulsion of Jews from Spain and the export through the slave trade of racial notions that were reproduced in a variety of different ways. Okay. And what I want to talk about are two figures in particular who creates a Jewish racial category for the North African Jewish population, Nahum Shalush, and for the East African population of Jews, Jacques Feitlovich. Nahum Shalush is a really fascinating character, and I do need to kind of read from the paper because he did a lot of stuff in his time. He's a Belarusian French-ish scholar who first encountered North African Jews in 1905 when he worked for the French colonial scientific mission in Morocco. His task was to compose the entire history of Jews in the Maghreb in a year. He would be able to do this. At the same time, he also worked as an instructor in Jewish schools, an archaeologist for the Zionist movement of the ITO, their Jewish Territorial Organization, and most significantly also as a spy in the Mediterranean and the US against Jewish populations. There was a concern that maybe they had sentiments of communist sentiments and things like that. And so he's doing these various different things, but his main work is really as a Zionist scholar of sorts, as well as a French spy. And in his travel narrative, which I've kind of reproduced some of the parts here, he maps out who Jews are. One of his projects is to actually look for Black and brown bodies, Jewish bodies in particular, to work the land. This was explicitly his goal for the Territorial Organization so that Eastern European Jews could perhaps live in Libya or Morocco as an alternative to Palestine at the time. This is in which, right before the decision to choose Palestine as the official homeland of the Jews. And in his book, he writes, their influence is to be met, speaking about African Jews in general, throughout the entire Atlas in Ethiopia and in the Sudan, where they are descendants of the Libyan Jews. Neither Greeks nor Romans nor Arabs have succeeded in repeopling it again. It is as if it is waiting its valiant Jewish aboriginals. This rhetorical turn really is meant to look at look at North Africa in general or African lands for colonization as empty lands that have this historic Jewish past in which the Jews who are living there are somewhat non-existent because they're frozen in this either medieval period of time or in this ancient period of time, and they needed to be revitalized by the Ashkenazi Jewish population. During his trip to Libya, he creates a narrative in which we can see some migration policies at play. And I'll say that I found this quote in one of the books that was cited in a migration policy towards Moroccan Jews in particular, in which they read his book, where he describes Libyan Jewish girls as little brown girls, half naked, their black eyes flashed out of black circles composed of flies that clung to them without causing them any discomfort. This is the scourge of the African Jew, caused by his disregard of even the elements of cleanliness and by constant exposure to sand and sun. So if we wonder how could they do these kind of things that we've heard about earlier today, this is the justification here. This idea that they're unhygienic, that there's some kind of eye problems. There was a significant kind of selection migration policy that was put in play, particularly against Moroccan Jews, because of the writings of Shalloush, actually. In the second category, we have something similar in which this is a transnational conversation. This is a book written in English by Morris Fishberg in 1912, The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment, and in which he quotes at length Shalloush as well as other Zionist race science scientists. All right, turning to okay, that's in the right place. Turning to East African Jews, I wanted to point out something that's similar here. This is a quote from 1966, but it echoes something from Karsten Neuber in the 1800s, as well as something that Jack Feitlevich, who we'll learn about in a second, said in the early 20th century, where he says, this Professor Edward Ullendorf, a British scholar, the so-called Judaism of the Falashas is merely a reflection of that general Semitic syncretism, pagan, Judaic, Syrian, Arabian Christian, that was implanted on parts of Southwest Arabia. I found this quite perplexing, and I was wondering where exactly did he get this from? And in fact, it is part of a quote in which Erman Burkhardt, who was a photographer and travel writer of sorts, says something in which he, while meeting with a Yemenite Muslim, a local Muslim resident in the 19th century, suggested that Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, quote, are not Bnei Israel, the pre-Islamic era Jews, but rather were Arabs who embraced Judaism. This quote was misinterpreted by Burkhardt himself as suggesting that the Jewish community in the Arabian Peninsula were not actually Jewish, but in fact he was saying that no, they're Yemenites just like us. They're Arabs in the sense, in the same way. But this trope got repeated time and time again that then became reproduced onto Jews throughout the Arabian Peninsula and in East Africa as well. So a little bit about the Beta Israel, who had been migrating to the Ottoman and Mandate Palestine and the State of Israel throughout the 19th century, but the largest period of migration is the 1970s through to 1990s. And most of the production or the understanding of East African Jewish history comes through European explorers and missionaries to this day. Jewish and Christian who provided the ammunition for the State of Israel to then impede their migration during the 1970s Derg Civil War that continued. This scholarship relied upon centuries of travel narratives from these European missionaries, and the works of Jacques Lévy and Feitlevich did come to this deadly conclusion in which culmination in which many Jews did die because they were not able to migrate to the country during the Civil War because of this large question of whether or not Jews there were actually authentically Jewish. And the question of the Falash Mora actually comes from this man pictured here. It's a lithograph portrait of Henry Aaron Stern. He is a German-born Jewish convert to Protestantism who then migrates to Britain. And then, as part of a colonial mission, tries to and successfully converts a large number of Ethiopian Jews to Christianity in the 19th century. During this time, he tries to make an argument that there is a sort of Jewish race that's clear. And that Jewish race has a lot to do with pale skin, or at least slightly paler, and that they were considerably different from the local native pagan populations, as he put it, saying that these people were so isolated from the rest of the world and so unsocial in all their habits that they were able to maintain a certain Jewishness for them. Similarly, when Jacques Feitlevich, a Polish-born Jewish scholar and travel writer, would go to the country and discover, as he put it, and as well as Nahum Shalush put it, discover more African Jews in the continent, he would say that they actually do belong to the Jewish race. Their African color, although their African color appears to contradict this, is what he writes in 1905. But then again, there's this theme of isolation, as they were for thousands of years from the co-religionists in other parts of the world, these Jews living in the very heart of the populations of this gigantic country of Africa. The point of these two kind of comparisons, and what I'm doing with these two quotes here, at least, is to point to a large standing theme that happens for Mizrahim, the idea that they're isolated from a larger Jewish population. Of course, Ethiopian Jews and Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, Yemenite Jews in particular, had a long-standing kind of cultural exchange. There are many Yemenite Jews who migrated to Ethiopia, many Yemenite Jews who migrated to other parts of the world through the British Empire or through other means, as well as Ethiopian Jews who moved to others. This idea of isolation, in a sense, was used as a rhetorical tool in order to erase their history. You can claim that there is nothing there because they're isolated, and then you can then rewrite their history through that. And what I wanted to point out, or at least kind of start doing today, is kind of think through, at least with you, if you have questions about it, is to think through, well, what does this erasure do? How do we actually repair this history of isolation, or kind of forced isolation? One way is to be a lot more self-reflective about and critically disengage from colonial tropes, understanding that actually a lot of what we know, or what we think we know about Mizrahi history at large, does come from colonial epistemologies and ways of producing knowledge in Jewish history. And although it creates a coherent narrative about how and why Jews migrated out of Africa and Asia in the 20th century, it does real harm to Afro-Asian Jews in general. In both cases, so to this day, the Fellish Moor population, those who were converted by Henry Aaron Stern, many of them relatives of Israeli Jews, are still in the country awaiting migration to Israel. And in the 1950s and 60s, of course, Moroccan Jews were subject to a number of different selective migration policies, as well as eye exams, DDT treatment, because of this understanding that they were unhygienic and, as Salush pointed out, that they had these huge eye problems with flies and things like that. So I want to stop there and kind of leave it open to questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both so much. Wow, this is all really heavy and complicated. And as always, I would love to hear some questions first. If there are any students who have questions. Not putting you on the spot, Tyler. Okay, I'll give you a minute to think of a question. Mindy? Okay, would you mind going over to the microphone that's over there? Sorry for the inconvenience.
This is overwhelming stuff.
It is.
We need a weekend on this.
So, just so you all know, if you weren't here earlier, the reason that we ask people asking a question to physically go over to that mic rather than bringing it to them is for not only the amplification, but also to be on the screen.
Okay, hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. Among other things, I'm vice president of something called the Jewish Study Center. Check us out. We have lots of interesting discussions, and our sessions are virtual and free. Okay, Tzvi, if I have it right?
Yes.
All right. In terms of what's going on now in Israel, I don't need to underscore the dissension that is growing. And you've talked about the Mizrahim, Sephardim, whatever word you want to use, seeing their ties now strongly with Bibi, okay? And we know the coalition's Bibi has been evolving. And the backlash and the contestation of what he and his coalition is up to is rebounding in ways that are certainly full of dissent and indeed venom. My question to you, where does this leave the portrayal of Bibi as a Moshiach and linking the future of Mizrahi Jews with him and what he's up to? That's one part. Second part, I'm fascinated with what you briefly alluded to in terms of Mizrahi coalitions with the Palestinians. Where that's going would be fascinating. And also relations between the Russian Jews with the world of the Mizrahim. Whatever you want to tackle.
Yeah. So I'll be very telegraphic, obviously. Number one, the notion that, the Mizrahim are completely allied with the Bibi camp, in entirety is wrong. This is something that he would like everybody to believe. The Likud historically always made that claims, but there are a lot of people who show elections after elections that this is not true. There are ways to measure that, but we need to understand something. Most of the voters for this bloc are Ashkenazic, okay, or at least half of them. And Mizrahim, a lot of Mizrahim vote for parties other than the right. And, you have studies even by mainstream economists who recently have shown that, it's also a class issue. So, the Mizrahi middle class, doesn't necessarily vote for the Likud. And those that do, they basically part of this politics of resentment, which reaches serious heights. The second thing is that we need to ask ourselves, after 45 years of almost continuous rule of the Likud, the big defender of Mizrahim, where are we now, and why? All studies show that the gap not only is persistent, it's even growing. They seem to not to have any answer for that. The current debate now about the Supreme Court, they complain about the fact that there's only one Mizrahi Supreme Court justice. Fact of the matter is that they've been in power for so many years, and whenever they had the chance, they stacked the court with Ashkenazic right-wingers, okay? And there are plenty of very, very good candidates for the Supreme Court of Mizrahi extraction. Some of them are present in this room right now, okay? So yet somehow they've been overlooked, okay? So it seems to me it's a sham. It's about, very, very strong propaganda that is being used, politics of resentment, and in fact, the issues that Mizrahim have against the history of the Labour Party, etc., it's true, okay. But the Likud has done nothing seriously to remedy that, but was able to use that, and is using it. This is a peak moment. The elections of 1981 were a peak moment. Then it subsided, and then it comes up again. Okay. For example, at some point, even Netanyahu expressed some understanding to the Yemeni babies affair, as we know it. Okay, and said all sorts of things. They tried actually even to pay some money and signaled some acceptance of one of the thorniest issues in Israeli history. Okay, without any accountability, of course, because that's part of the game. The second is where we're going now with that. I believe that, first of all, if I may say, and I'm not speaking as a scholar, I believe we're headed to a disaster. I think that the demons of Israel are coming to haunt it, finally. Its own past, the Palestine question, which has never been resolved or been made worse, the questions of the settlement, is now, all of this is now, we are now being put to test. History is now testing us, okay? And if we test it honestly and truthfully, we may pass the test with a lot of pain. But if we continue to lie to ourselves, we will fail, and everybody will fail. Now, it is interesting how, the right wing, the Likud, was able to convert, social resentment into political cash. But I don't think that in the United States after 2016, I have to explain how people are able to do that. Okay. I don't know what was the third question. Yeah.
Relationship with the Russians?
Yes. Okay, one more thing about the Palestinians. People on the Mizrahi left have tried always to form alliances with the Palestinians. The Black Panthers met in Rome with members of the PFLP. In 1989, Mizrahi activists went to meet leaders of the PLO in Toledo. Yes. I missed that one because I didn't have a passport yet. But as soon as I got a passport, I went to another one. Okay. So people did try to do that. Okay. We now fall victim to another policy of separation. It's also the era of alliance between Jews and Palestinians together, regardless of who they are, is also over because there is mistrust and boycott. Okay, so the politics of solidarity, the possibility of solidarity is gone. And one of the things that the reasons that, this government is able to rule is because the solidarity among Israelis and among Israelis and Palestinians is gone. The possibility of it is gone. That's why this situation is so tragic. Speaking of that notion of solidarity, yes, there were tensions between Russian Jews or Russian immigrants and Mizrahi Jews. The trigger for the Black Panther eruptions was the coming of the Brezhnev immigration in 1970-71, okay, where they saw that they were coming in and they're getting houses and, they don't. Something similar to that triggered the 1990 eruption, which I was discussing here. But here's the other thing that we see today. Today, class matters. And most of the Russians, at least those who are represented in the Israel Beitenu Lieberman party, are not, even though they are on the right, they are not part of this government. Okay? So in other words, in many ways, I think that, there will be a Russian-Mizrahi alliance eventually. When we get out of the Venetian carnival of masks, and we'll talk about real politics, then eventually, it will be about that. And, a lot of the poorer classes in Israel today are Russians. They live in settlements. They live in development towns. They live, among poor areas, where Mizrahim also lives. And this will be a form of alliance, God willing.
Wow. Thank you. Do we have another question? Any students? Student question? Student question? No. Okay. Going once, going twice. Judy, please. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, all right. So, Judy. In the back, are you a student? Oh, okay. That's it.
Okay, sorry.
I didn't think so.
My question for Professor Brian, I would ask, what it motivated exactly, because you mentioned that, the Jewish history in Africa, maybe it was written by, some scholars or, people from Poland or, Belarus, yeah. What motivated these people exactly to dig into, this history in that time? And the second question, as far as I know, Zionism or Zionist expression, it came from Europe, not from Africa. How much do you think that Jewish African people are believing in Zionist ideas or identify themselves as Zionists? Specifically, as I'm from Egypt, before the revolution 2011, we had a lot of news about smugglers and a lot of network of human trafficking, people from Africa, from Sudan, from Ethiopia. And of course, this is not a good thing, but even though Israel somehow or some Israelis allowed that happened, do you think this is another sign as well that the Jewish African for Israel are just additional population or just cheap laborers or something like that? This my two questions for you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one. I'll say that at least in terms of the two people that I'm looking at, Solution Faitlevich, or Solution in particular, less so Faitlevich, they are looking for, he is looking for labor. Like he's looking for bodies for, Jewish bodies in particular for labor. In terms of why they were interested in it, in my book, Solution figures as a kind of villain figure. I really dislike the guy for a number of different reasons, and Faitlevich is kind of nicer. And Solution is interested because he is working for the person that's Lyoté, who's known as the empire builder of France. And he's an Orientalist. He, is trained at the Sorbonne, and he is tasked with writing all of Jewish history in Africa. And he's paid for this quite substantially, and is able to travel around. So this is part of why he's interested in the case. But in addition, he's also looking for possible expansion projects for Lyoté, who wanted to go into the hinterlands. Successfully, he did after 1914 of Morocco, and possibly expand to what Italy then took over as Cyrenaica, Libya. So this is part of his particular project. Faitlevich, on the other hand, Jacques Faitlevich, who goes to East Africa, has a much nicer kind of reasoning for this. He wants to save the Jewish population there. They had gone through a number of different wars, and there was a substantial history of transition that was going on. Henry Aaron Stern was successful in his proselytizing, Christianizing mission. He converted lots and lots of Jews. Some people had heard about this, and so Jacques Faitlevich wanted to make sure that that kind of expansionism, Christian expansion of converting Jews away from Judaism, would not continue. So that was his project. But he did frame it in this very kind of, white savior narrative. He took at least a couple, maybe if not more, young Jewish boys or teenagers to go live in England as an example for the community, because people didn't believe him that there was possibly black Jews in existence. And so he sent at least one off to England to live with the family as a kind of, exhibition spectacle of some sorts. And in terms of, you asked about human trafficking through Egypt.
Why Israel allow that? It's okay to let people go there. I don't think it's for saving them.
No. So you're talking about, so this is the non-Jewish population coming from Sudan or in East Africa as well, right? Through Egypt.
Yeah, but some of them, many of them are Jewish people, in terms of going to that Israel as a country, as for that right went from that Israel. I think that there is exploiting, Jewish exploiting Jewish, even if you speak about saving Jewish, but I think there is some economic exploiting labor exists because of the color. They don't
Okay,
talk
all right,
them
that's fine.
respectfully as Jewish came from Europe.
All right. I think we're going to go on to another question to try to get
Sorry, yeah.
more questions in here. Howard, please go to the mic. And then, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you. And then you'll after.
Thank you, Lauren. Howard Marks. I live here in the district. I'm a community member. Been active in Jewish organizations. Been to Israel 23 or 24 times. So I have probably the oddest reason for being here, and that is that my son 10 days ago married into a Mizrahi family in Israel.
Mazal tov.
Thank you so much, Tadar Rabah. And so I met with them, as mishpucha, so to speak, and they start saying how they're Likud and how much they really adore Bibi, and in general. And then finally, I talked to their sons, the sons of my part of the family, young men that are 16 or 17, and I says, "What kind of religious education do you get?" They said, "Well, we study Tanakh, we study Torah in the schools." So, but they're trying to take it away from us. I says, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "There's people out there," indicating people on the left, that say that it offends secularists and it offends groups of people in the population. I assume they're talking about the left wing in Israel, whatever. So, Svi, I had a question for you. Are these legitimate fears? I mean, is there is there concern on people on the right and people in Likud, like my Mishpucha supporters, that in fact some of the religious aspects of Israel are at risk? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is like real legitimate fears, because in fact I have in my pocket a plan that, you know, we will begin with the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, Das Kapital. And in 6th grade, all Israeli kids will be reading Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, which in my view is like a serious abomination. No, here's the thing. Ben-Gurion placed a lot of emphasis on the Bible, perhaps too much. It was the cornerstone of Israeli education was the Bible always, including many other things. What he's probably describing is, you know, a completely ridiculous propaganda, which is belongs to one of the anomalies. The religious Zionist education system is completely intact. No one would enter there would teach liberal stuff. In fact, now, then you have the Haredi ones, which we're not going to talk about. They're even more further, okay? And then you have the mainstream Israeli secular system, which has been subjected to a lot of religious extracurricular education in the past 20 years, despite of, you know, all of these denials. The paradox is that the more they do this, the more they claim that, you know, the Israeli identity is being taken away, and by all sorts of evil postmodernists or Marxists. I wish this was the truth, at least with regards to Marxists. I'm open about it. But that was never the truth. Okay. Yes. So, you know, when I was in 1st grade in 1971, so we had a Bible teacher who would say, well, you know, let's read about the Exodus. And, well, it didn't really happen. Okay, because it was a secular state. Or they used to say, well, you know, there is no God, but he promised us the land. Okay. Okay. That's a quote of a friend of mine. But the point is that, you know, I mean, the Bible was never not part of it, and Jewish holidays were always taught. I think part of the situation now is that there is again a somewhat mechanical, artificial attempt to import, you know, American-style culture wars and plant them in Israel. And then in the name of that, you know, drive all sorts of other political agendas. No, I'm not necessarily liberal Americans. I'm specifically talking about culture wars here. You know, here there's a war on Christmas. Okay, so now we're going to have the war on Pesach. Okay, the truth is that, you know, Israeli schools have always followed, you know, a Jewish liturgy. You know, whether they were secular or not. Okay, and the sense now is that, you know, all of this is under attack. I can tell you more is our attack. You have something that we always thought was very boring and meaningless, which is called in Hebrew ezrahut. Yes, which I don't know even how to translate into English. It means basically they teach you how to be citizenship. Yes, I know, but how do you teach it as a subject? It's basically you had one point in the Israeli diploma where they teach you how to be a citizen. Civics. Yes, civics. Thank you. In the past decade, civics teachers were targeted by the state, and, you know, been questioned what they teach. And the idea of being a citizen with rights, the idea of teaching civics suddenly became politicized. Okay? In other words, the idea that, you know, you have a constitution or you have the law, and, you know, citizens in Israel have duties and have rights, etc., which is taught as part of the curriculum forever, in the past decade became politicized. Now, did all civics teachers in Israel like conspire, you know, to drive the children into some sort of a left-wing conspiracy? No. Somebody else decided that that's the case. If you look at the number of how much money is pouring into Israel right now, particularly from the United States, yes, in order to drive all sorts of agendas that some of them don't even make sense. Okay? For example, you know, Ayn Rand, libertarianism. What are you talking about? Okay? We are the ones who, in the Bible, you have all of these social laws. Okay? In the Bible, you have all of these social laws. Suddenly, you know, Ayn Rand. And by the way, some people, there are now people in Israel with all sorts of philosophies that Ayn Rand is a radical Bolshevik next to them. Okay.
Wow.
So it's part of a certain propaganda, and I know I'm being filmed, but it's a certain propaganda. Civics has been targeted and become politicized, and being questioned, etc. And I'm not talking about all sorts of the other things. The truth is that what Netanyahu government just did now is give 2 billion shekels to, he resigned now, to someone to teach all the extracurricular programs in mainstream schools, in the secular schools. Okay. So they are the ones who are being right now being targeted. The notion that the Jewish tradition is under attack is as similar as if you think about the way they talk about Christmas and the word Christmas in Fox News. It is as real and as unreal.
Thank you. We'll take one more question because I promised her. The person, I can't see her. Yes. Can you please go to the microphone, please?
I just wanted to clarify something. So I agree with Whoopi that the Jews are not a race, and the philosophers are one example to prove that. And I didn't understand what you were saying when you were talking about her question about Jews being a race. I don't think Jews are a race.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, the idea of race itself is a construct, and so how do we construct it is really what I'm getting at in that sense. And so then, really, I'm not sure exactly what you wanted clarification on.
I want you to say that Judaism is not a race.
I didn't say that.
No, I know, but I wasn't clear where you stood.
There's a whole science of even Jewish race scientists, anthropologists, about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Very popular discipline.
It's kind of framed as race mania. This is early 20th century kind of European study of race as a thing. And that still is oftentimes influence in our mindsets of how we approach things. But I'm not arguing that anyone is a race or a racial category.
Okay,
It's
just
a
wanted to
construct, yeah.
Thank you. So I just want to make one closing comment that, that the passion, the degree of passion in this room just is evidence that these topics are not only relegated to the past, but they are always ever current and ever green, and issues of race and identity, and also the politicization of the teaching of history and all those issues that that we see in the news in this country, whether critical race theory can be taught, whether AP African American history can be taught. This is not relegated to one country, and it's really an example of how useful and productive these kinds of scholarly interchanges are on so many levels. And so, keep up the good work. There's never a dearth of material. So you all must be hungry, and I think we're gonna take a little break now. Thank you.